I beg you to try it, Patricia.
Let me get this straight, Carla. You disagree on the weapon, you disagree on the number of blows.
Listen to me, Patricia. You were there once in your life.
Hey people, Trish Wood here. This is going to be, it's a really dark day, by the way. I'm sitting at my desk, and I have a big, lovely, old kind of English Tudor-style window with muntins, squares. And as I sit here looking through one of the squares up at the sky, it's very, very dark and raining, which I like because that feels very cozy and kind of English countryside-ish to me. But I will tell you, based on what we're going to be talking about today, that the darkness is just actually darkness. And I am feeling like there is something terribly, terribly wrong in our post-COVID world. I feel that the kind of proverbial chickens are coming home to roost. I take absolutely no satisfaction whatsoever over a prediction I made last week when we kind of did a deep dive into the Peyton Gendron Buffalo terrible shooting of black people in a Tops grocery market there by a guy who was 18 when he did it, but 15 or 16 when COVID hit and the lockdowns happened and the schools closed. And his own personal history is an absolute tragedy of American culture, that teenagers are growing up the way he did, obviously very mentally ill, bullied, and terrified of COVID. And I mean, it's almost inexplicable what happened. But in a sense, as I said last week, and as many people have been saying for 2 years, that teenagers and children were going to be ruined, some of them, by what we were doing. The problem is already struggling kids put into a situation that tests their mental health are going to be made worse. So their baseline is bad, and this makes it worse. That's what happened to Peyton, and that is what happened on Tuesday in Uvalde, Texas. And I said last week, we're going to have another one, and it might be soon. And it happened like a week later. And they're almost identical cases. These two guys shot people in different groups. One was focused on a racist black narrative, and the other one just wanted to destroy things, and he picked children, young children. And it's what's happening here is exposing a lot of things that were kind of theoretical and that the media wouldn't cover. You know, the media wouldn't really cover the mental health crisis in teenagers during COVID because it flew in the face of their beloved narrative of school closures and lockdowns, right? They did say, oh, yes, the American Academy of Pediatrics is worried, and various child psychiatrists would say we've got a big problem, but they weren't really covering it. They weren't setting up alarm bells. But these two instances, you cannot ignore it. They're going to try to blame it on other things, and there's probably a gun piece to this, but that's not what we're dealing with today. We're going to deal with this, with the mental health crisis, but also what the handling of this story means for our culture in general. I mean, I'm just going to say this, and we're going to get into it in a little while, but I'm going to say this. I never thought in my lifetime, as a woman living in North America, that I would see a day when cops were more interested in their own safety than that of helpless children. But that seems to be what's happened in Uvalde. It is. There was a guy last night on CNN, one of the top cops spokesmen there, who said something along those lines. And I'm going to play you the clip if you haven't already heard it, but you need to hear it again, even if you have. And the other thing, it's a massive expose of the absolute and utter failure of media, too. The media covering both the Buffalo story and the Uvalde, Texas story spend, not all of them, but some of them, most of them, many of them, usually the big stars for sure, spend a lot of time emoting and being empathetic. There was an interview that Anderson Cooper did this week with a parent of a dead child in Uvalde it made me actually sick to my stomach the way he performed, right? I just want to say something. It's not our role as journalists to emote and look empathetic. The way it's not the role of a surgeon to weep and cry and carry on over his patients, although he may feel something later. He doesn't. You don't do that, or you're a psychiatrist, if you've seen one, most of them, they sit there kind of neutrally taking down the information for two reasons. Number one, it's unprofessional for them to be emoting along with you. I would feel uncomfortable with someone who was doing that. And secondly, and I can tell you this as someone who's done interviews for 40 years and done them well, and done them with some of the most traumatized people in the world in the worst circumstances, people whose children were murdered by Ted Bundy, a kid in Toronto who was third-degree burns to 90% of his body and his family. I've been to Rwanda. I've been to a lot of places where people are traumatized and upset, and I had a career in true crime. So I interviewed a lot of traumatized people, right? And the way you get an interview that has validity and detail is to be quiet and let them work through what they're thinking and saying. That's what a journalist does. So what happens both in the Buffalo and the Uvalde cases is the media rush in and they're all doing this disgusting, we're praying for you, our hearts go out to you. I don't know what that even means, right? But it's a virtue, it's a new kind of virtue signaling. I would much rather that these reporters, instead of doing this kind of performance art that serves no purpose but to make them, in their minds, more popular with the viewers, they should be working the goddamn story. Pardon my French. They should be working the story and not emoting, right? I don't want to see Anderson Cooper hugging parents. It's not his role. And if they had been paying attention, the story that is now unfolding about the police in action there would have been uncovered 2 days ago. And I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to play you a piece of tape, and I'm going to explain to you why this was a huge giveaway that the police were in trouble and hiding something. So just listen to this piece of tape. It's from the very first news conference the police gave in Uvalde, Texas. And let me say this to you. I was watching it, my jaw dropped at what a performance it was. And I turned to my husband and I said, they're hiding something. Something really bad beyond these shootings has happened with this police department, and they're trying to hide it. Listen to this.
The investigation is not complete. We will only be sharing a statement with you, not providing questions. We greatly appreciate your patience and understanding. Here to share a statement and not take questions is our Uvalde CISD Chief of Police, Pete Arredondo.
Thank you. Good evening. Again, briefly, as of now, we're still working on this active investigation. Once we're able to provide information to the families, we will do so first and foremost, obviously. Our priorities is to get information to our families and give them some information. So please bear with us in regards to that. Secondly, once we do get some information that we can release to the public, we will be doing that. So please know once we do get some information, we will share that with you and call another press conference. Let me assure you, the intruder is deceased, and we are not actively looking for another individual or any other suspects in this case. We definitely ask you all to keep the families that are involved in your prayers. Thank you so much.
Here to provide a statement and not take any questions is our Superintendent, Dr. Hal Harrell.
Good evening.
This was a tragic and senseless event today, and my heart was broke today. Our hearts and thoughts and prayers are with all our families as we go through this day and days to come. A few announcements that we need to make is beginning tomorrow at 10 a.m., we will have grief counseling and support at the Civic Center for our students, our staff, community members, anybody that needs to come at that time. And we may be there more than one day, may be there several days. Our ROB staff will meet at 8 a.m. at the Civic Center as well. We'll begin with visiting with them and seeing what those needs are. School will be closed. The school year's done. We will have no school tomorrow or Thursday. All activities are canceled throughout the district. I know graduation is on people's mind. We will come out with a notice on that at a later time. All the staff members, they will report to their campuses, other than Rob campus, which will come to the Civic Center. Again, my heart was broken today. We're a small community, and we'll need your prayers to get us through this. Thank you.
Again, this is a tragic event in our community. We are very sorry that we cannot provide you more information, but greatly appreciate your patience and understanding during this very difficult time.
Right. So they say nothing to a room full of reporters who abide by this arbitrary rule that they can't ask any questions. And did you notice how she kept repeating it? I mean, there was just something, in the olden days, as I say, probably much too frequently on the show. You're going to get sick of it, and me one day, but I'm going to keep saying it. The reporters would never have sat there docile in that sense. They would have been asking questions anyway. You know how when someone doesn't want to take questions and they leave the podium and the reporters are all yelling, it seems rude, but look at these guys are paid to keep children safe. Right? They're paid to make sure this stuff doesn't happen. They come out, they don't have an answer. And what the main question a reporter asks under these circumstances from day one is timeline, 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 timeline. Right? And they did not want to address the issue of the timeline because the timeline, as we are looking at it now, as of last night, this is what I suspected, by the way, when I saw the news conference. Something was hinky. The timeline now shows that the police from various police organizations were outside that school for between 40 minutes and an hour before they went in. And by that time, as I understand it, I could be wrong about this, the shooter was already dead. But here's what I want to say to you. Because in order to fully take on how grotesque this is, think about yourself. I actually, and this is true, I'm not just, this is not, hyperbole or kind of hopeful invention about the people I know. I don't know anyone in my life right now who could sit in front of an elementary school with an active shooter, gunfire going off, children dying, obviously, the gunfire, and not run in and do something. You would have to, for most of the people I know, have nailed them to the street. I mean, how can a person not go in to rescue children? It's getting some headlines, but this is a big, big story, and I think we need to shut the whole world down for a week until we can sort this out. What the hell is going on? Where are the brave people, the brave men in our society right now? Where are they? What have we done to them? Right? Do you remember the World Trade Center? The wonderful, wonderful firemen that every woman in the world had a crush on a NYFD guy, like we all wanted to marry them. There was funny T-shirts and little, kitschy trinkets about the New York Fire Department because they were men and maybe women too, if there were women, do forgive me for leaving them out in my talk here. I wouldn't have been surprised if there were women who went in, actually. But they didn't care about their own safety. They knew they might die. There was probably a good chance they knew they would die given the circumstances. And they went in to save other people. That's what heroes are. Heroes aren't just overweight people who are coming to terms with the fact that they have to wear a bathing suit, which seems to be what we're celebrating only these days. Heroism is also actually risking your life for other people because you're a good person. I mean, I'll just say this. Is there a life really for any of those cops now knowing what they didn't do? Can they just go happily on about their lives? Look, we all make mistakes, and I'm not saying I wish them eternal damnation. I hope they sort it out. But healthy people who do that kind of unforgivable thing will be plagued for guilt for a very, very long, long time. How do you explain what happened in Uvalde? I can't do it. It's too scary, but I believe it reflects, as I said last week, this is our new post-COVID world. Safety first for everybody, cowardness, selfishness. Heroism is getting a vaccine. Oh, I got my vaccine, right? I know I'm focusing a bit much on COVID here, but something's changed, right? And all the people who knew that we were being changed slowly over the past 2 years by the cruel and inhuman things that we were being asked to do or subscribe to or be part of, and we did nothing. That's why the truckers were so important, because they were doing something. Is this the price now that we're paying? Have we become so immoral now after this experience with the public health policy that, in my view, was immoral and made us behave in immoral ways, some of us? Is this part of it? What we're facing now? I mean, I just am absolutely flabbergasted. I've had phone calls from women this morning saying, what the hell is going on with men? I know that men are kind of battered and bruised these days, and masculinity is we don't even really know what that is anymore, and it's perceived as a bad thing. I don't think those things, but I'm of a certain generation, But what the hell? These guys became cops, I guess, to serve and protect, and they didn't do that here. And we need to get to the bottom of this right now. So last night on CNN, Wolf Blitzer interviewed one of the cops who has been designated a spokesman on this issue. And he says the absolute unthinkable. He says it. He says it. Listen to him say it on Wolf Blitzer's show.
But don't current best practices, Lieutenant, call for officers to disable a shooter as quickly as possible, regardless of how many officers are actually on site?
Correct. The active shooter situation, you want to stop the killing, you want to preserve life. But also, one thing that, of course, the American people need to understand is that officers are making entry into this building. They do not know where the gunman is. They are hearing gunshots. They are receiving gunshots. At that point, if they proceeded any further, not knowing where this suspect was at, they could have been shot. They could have been killed. And at that point, that gunman would have the opportunity to kill other people inside that school. So they were able to contain that gunman inside that classroom so that he was not able to go to any other portions of the school to commit any other killings.
Right. So they let the children die so he wouldn't kill children. That seems to be the argument he is making. It is an argument it's not an argument. You can't even argue this. You just can't argue why men did not go in to rescue children who were being shot by a gunman. You can't do it, right? So he's in a really tough spot, that guy too. And the other thing you'll note, now I'm going to timestamp this. This is 10:32 in the morning on May 27th, Friday, right? So this could change by the time you hear it. We're dropping it tonight, right? But the kids were saved by a Border Patrol Special Tactical Unit dude who, I think he took it upon himself. That's my feeling. That's probably going to come out, and just said, screw it, I'm going in, right? Him and a couple of other guys. I think. I might not be right about that, but here's the interesting thing about him. No, they're not mentioning his name. So he actually is the hero cop in this, and they're not mentioning his name, which is quite strange. You think they'd want to have a big newser, and maybe they will. By the time you hear this, you will know who this guy is who went in and into that classroom. But they're keeping his name under wraps. So this is awful. If you haven't figured out how I feel about it, to me, this is a new low in American history, right? It's a new low. There is video. You will see it. I'm not going to play it here, but you will see it. And if you can't find it, let me know and I'll send it to you or post it somewhere. But of the parents waiting outside the school with their children in the school, begging the police to go in, who wouldn't go in. Parents who got kind of uppity about it and were going to maybe charge through. One of them, I think they had a taser pointed at them or something. Another one was handcuffed. There's a shot of a parent on the ground with the cops on. Like, what the heck is going on here? So, I mean, can you imagine being those parents? You're outside the school. There's somebody in your kid's classroom shooting people. You can't go in. They won't let you risk your life. They're not going to risk their lives. And everybody's just sort of standing around. As one of the cops said, oh, we were waiting for equipment. What equipment were you waiting for? What equipment, right? You go in with a gun and you shoot the person. He might shoot you first and you might die. But if you die, while he's shooting you, another person can get him and it's going to be over. Yeah, maybe a cop has to die to save those children, right? What gear are you waiting for? I don't know, body armor, whatever. And then the last thing really to think about, which just raises the terror level around those poor children. I think the caliber weapon he was using probably does a lot of damage, and many of the people hopefully were killed instantly. That would be my prayer. But what if some of them weren't and were salvageable if the police had gotten in there and got them out to hospital sooner? We will never know that, will we? Were they even thinking about that? I don't know. But this is a very, very dark day in American history. And the list of failures from journalism, please don't let the journalists off the hook for being lazy and stupid. Don't do that. Don't do it. And don't believe it when they're saying, thoughts and prayers. They're not. It's a performance. Right? I'm not saying they're mean. I'm sure they're upset. Those are hard stories to do. I did a story in Toronto. I was just thinking about police and how much I love them mostly, where a little girl had been murdered and they found her body and it came across the police scanner, and I had a police scanner. I was a police reporter intermittently. And I went to the place and I got there right when the cops were getting there. And Inspector Crawford, who's now deceased, but he was a very brave guy, and he got there first. And I went into, there was a little hut there. This was like 1979. There's a little hut there, and I went in to do something. I don't know, change batteries in my recorder or something like that. And he was in there. I didn't see him go in crying, right? He'd just seen the body. He was in there crying and hiding from the reporters so we wouldn't see that he was very, very upset. Of course, it made me love him even more, this big, tough guy, Jim Crawford from Metro PD, right? So, they have hard jobs and they're people and they feel things, but that does not, I can't see Jim Crawford ever standing around letting kids be shot. I can't actually ever see that happening, but they are people. So here's what we're going to do today. I opened last week the idea that the shooters were being affected by COVID policy. And so I got two people on the show today, now that we have this second event, predicting there's going to be more of these, and there is. And also trying to put into some perspective how destabilizing the world was for people like this during COVID, right? With the lockdown, school closures, all that sort of stuff. Now, we are not letting these two guys off the hook. We're not at all. But I'm also not going to say, oh, well, we have the answer. It's evil, which means nothing. And I'm a Catholic, right? So when I'm saying that in this context, hear me out. Saying it's evil doesn't solve anything. Or that it's guns. Part of it, I'm sure. But look at, if the police had behaved, if there'd been better mental health care for these guys, a whole bunch of other stuff that could have happened that would have maybe inverted this tragedy somehow too. So just hiding behind guns are terrible and responsible for everything is also it's just a political flex, and we know that. The other thing that's being said, by the way, just about guns is that these things don't happen in Canada. I do talk a bit to our two experts. That's actually not true, but they tend to happen in different ways. And yesterday, there was a shooting in Toronto yesterday. Suspect shot dead by Toronto police after schools locked down over reports of man with a rifle. Might have been a BB gun, actually. But here's another one. Police described deadly shooting inside East End Toronto High School as execution. 14-year-old boy charged. He walked in with a gun and shot another student. So, and those numbers around these events in Toronto, in good old Canada, where people think we have, this like magic thing that nothing bad ever happens here around guns. It does. The numbers are going up, right? The average age of those involved in gun violence now, it used to be 25, now it's 20. All kinds of higher capacity magazine increases, all kinds of stuff going on. So we're not exempt from this, and I suspect it's going to get worse here too, probably in different ways. We had a big thing here a few years ago where a guy who was doing a mass killing drove a van over a bunch of people on the sidewalk too. So, and in Britain, there are a lot of knife attacks. So many things happen. Guns are bad when they fire quickly because you can do a lot of damage in a short amount of time. That's the problem with guns, right? Is that they're very efficient killers as far as that goes. So we're not going to talk about that stuff. We're going to talk about what we began talking about last week. And our guests are Michael Lesher, who is a lawyer who specializes in helping children in child abuse cases. And he's out of New York. And he's a very, very smart cat. And also Paul Elias Alexander. Some of you people may know him. He's a big deal. He was a former advisor to President Trump and HHS during COVID. And he's quite interesting because he talks about how worried they were back then about closing the schools and what it might lead to. And he could not engage the media in those discussions, right? And they couldn't engage the media because it was Trump's idea. That's how sick society is right now. And he's hugely credentialed, Oxford, a bunch of things. So those are the interviews. I'm doing them together. And I will warn you, we lose Paul about midway through due to an internet issue I found out later. So, but he sounds great and it's really worth listening to. And it's very, very scary because both of them are saying this is going to get worse before it gets better. And they clearly mark the trail between what happened starting in March of 2020 and what we are seeing now as the result of that. This is what it looks like when there's a mental health crisis, people. This is what it is. Right? So I'm going to do my pitch now for support from you all. And I just want to say there's obviously two kinds of support. One of them is just the avalanche of emails and Patreon messages and Twitter notes I've been getting from people about my long COVID struggle, which is getting better and better, but I'm still not perfect, and rest is high on the agenda too, because it's really nuts. It's like if I have a big, big work day, the next day I'm kind of bagged out. Let me just tell you, before COVID, I was working 7 days a week. I get up at 5 a.m. like a nut, right? Sometimes 4:30, and I start working. That's just what I do in this new life of reporting on living in the matrix, bad COVID policy, and all the other crazy stuff that's going on. So that was my life, and I was probably overdoing it. Now I couldn't even, that's not even in the ballpark for me, but I am able to do my show and some of their content creation. But I must say that the notes I've gotten from people really are so valuable. It's really meaningful. Thank you. I did also on Patreon, but for free so everybody can see it, post what was working for me, which is these two antihistamines that I did a lot of research online. There's a little report in one of the journals about these two women who used antihistamines, certain kind. Go to the Patreon and you'll see. You can look at it even if you're not a member. I didn't think it was fair to hide it. And they had these kind of miraculous recoveries. And that happened to me to a point. I went from 50% battery energy to 75, 80 now. So that's pretty good. And the headaches are gone. Praise be to God for that. And the body pain is mostly gone. So there you go. But my point is, thank you for caring about me. I care about you too. And that's why I'm still here saying things that might get me in trouble. And then the other kind of support obviously is financial. We would be, I know, Substack has got all these brilliant writers, and you guys probably, given how smart you are and how engaged, you're probably really struggling on where to send your money now, because there is no dearth of wonderful, wonderful independent media out there who we should celebrate and cheer for. I hope you feel that we are worthy. You need to think about how you spend your media money in a different way now, I think, because the big boys in legacy media who cost so much are not doing a very good job. And then you've got to find the people like me out here and curate us and help us stay alive financially so we can keep doing it. So I'm always grateful when I see a new membership coming in. And thank you for that. So here's how you do it. Sorry, I got a bit distracted there going down. I was getting all nostalgic for all the nice notes you've sent me. So let's just get back to business here. So the way to do it is to go to my website, trishwoodpodcast.com. There's a button. It's either PayPal or Patreon. I know we don't like Patreon, but we're going to keep going there until things settle down a bit with me. I also have a Substack, and that will also have a pay component attached to it really quickly. So if you just want to give through Substack, that's fine. Substack is an organization that doesn't believe in censorship, so we obviously believe in them, and that's why we're going to move there eventually. But we still need support in the meantime, so don't forget that. My Twitter is, by the way, @WoodReporting, if you don't know that. And I'm usually on there with a couple of things to talk about every day. And I have an Instagram as well, which I think is Trish Wood Podcast. I don't go there as much because I find Instagram really complicated. And I have a YouTube channel. We have not been going there so much because I cut that out just temporarily, but that's up and running. And my email address is info@trishwoodpodcast.com. So, okay. Let's get to the meat of the discussion, which we began last week. And now with the second incident, we're continuing on with our wonderful, thoughtful guests, Michael Lesher and Paul Elias Alexander. Hi, Paul and Michael. I'm so glad you are doing this. I've been kind of angry most of the week since the discussion around these two terrible mass shootings has been pretty much hijacked by politics. And people only really last night began talking about the mental health crisis that is plaguing our young people. I don't know if we can draw a direct line between it, but I actually feel today after this event on earlier in the week in Uvalde that maybe we can. I did say last week when we reported on Peyton Gendron, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, that we would be seeing another one of these soon for exactly the reasons we're going to be talking about today. I did not expect to see it like a week later, but let's go. So I'll start with you, Paul. What was your response when you first got wind that there was yet another mass shooting involving an unhappy teenager.
Well, thanks, Trish, for having me on your show. And let me get straight to the point. Well, look, because I had worked in the administration in the United States, and I had access to information that was showing us the devastating impact of the lockdown and the school closure on the children, the young people, teenagers, etc. We had young people and children committing suicide across the United States in the various states. And it was a real battle that we waged with the task force, with Fauci, Birx, with the CDC, with the NIH. So it was a huge problem, but we were actually seeing the data that the news media was not reporting. And I think that is the key here. The news media did not report the actual deaths and harms from the lockdowns and the school closures that were quickly occurring because President Trump was in election mode. And this was about maybe July, August. And they did not want to, because he was on the podium every day with the task force, and he was arguing with them about opening schools. He was arguing and fighting the unions. And it was visible because we were looking at it, well, people in his society. So you knew he was having a confrontation with and his own task force was going against what he was calling for. Yeah. So the news media in Washington decided, and I know this because I was there and I had access to discussions, they decided that they will not report the nature or the suicides, etc. I mean, we had children that hung themselves. And the reason was that it would make Trump look very credible if the media actually reported what was happening to young people, because then it will line up with his calls, his cries to open the schools. And then the CDC and the NIH and the teachers' unions would look very, very complicit and in a bad way. So they decided they'll pretend it's not happening. We were seeing serious, serious problems. And when I saw the Buffalo, I was looking at stats prior to that. So I knew that there had been a jump. We were averaging about 30 mass shootings a year in the United States, 2016, 17, 18, 19. But in 2020, it jumped to 40. So that was about a 30-odd% increase. That's something to make you open your eyes. But then in 2021, it jumped to 61. So that was like over 50% increase. And then I had seen some stats, again, because I'm involved in COVID and these issues, where in 2022, this year, just for the first 5 months, we have about 220. Some figures say 202, some say 220, some say 230, depending on which FBI report you look at.
And these are, what are you categorizing in the 220? These are multiple shootings by young people, or what is the number?
Well, mass shooting that involves more than one.
Mass shootings, okay.
Yeah, it's mass shootings I'm talking about here.
Yeah, okay, got it.
That involves more than one casualty, one person shot. So what the data was showing us was that the mass shootings peak in the month of June. They are often carried out on a Saturday. They often involve commercial type properties with a lot of people, like the mall, those types of properties. And I was shocked that there were so many mass shootings in the United States. It made me realize too that the media is not covering this properly because we know of them, but not that we have over 230 so far in the first 5 months of this year in the United States. So we're on track to have about 400. Mm-hmm. Remember, last year there was 61.
And interesting, I just want to butt in here so people fully take on what you're saying and so it can land. This increase in shootings is not just in mentally ill teenage boys, right? You're talking about mass shootings across the board, which represents a mental health crisis across the board, not just in these young teenage shooters. But if the numbers are going up across all demographics, then that can also be attributed to the same kind of social and cultural contagion that was let loose on everybody through these really onerous measures, correct?
Mm-hmm. The reality about it is that the lockdowns and the COVID restrictions, the policies, devastated everyone across the board, not just young people. And we have a looming problem because we've not tended to the mental well-being of people. And people lost a lot, not just economically. They lost a lot of loved ones. They lost a lot of, some estimates are that I've read an economic report as part of a paper that an op-ed I'd written some time ago that said that it will take the balance of the 21st century, the next 80 odd years, for us to regain what we lost economically and society, to move back to that spot. So that might never even happen. But the truth is, the question you really asked was what I felt, and the truth is that the teen that shot up the place in Buffalo in the Tops grocery, he was 18 years old.
Yeah.
And now the teen that shot up here in Texas, Uvalde, is 18 years old. I mean, there are things that are beginning to emerge, some eerie similarities that raises a lot of questions. And the truth of the matter is that for a lot of young people, when a government and authority figures just one day stand up and say, you know what, your life has stopped at this moment. So February, March of 2020, we're locking everything down. You can't go to school. You can't go to the mall. You can't go by your friends. You can't go to the park, the open playground, the open park where you could hang out. You can't play sports. I mean, at the height of this lockdown, I have written about them as lockdown lunatics in the Trump administration, and lockdown lunatics was in Biden administration, lockdown lunatics in Canada, in UK, in Australia, in every country. Well, I mean, Shanghai and Beijing now in China has shown you how far the lunacy could go. But these lockdown lunatics never did, not up to today. No one has done a cost-benefit, cost-effectiveness analysis of alternative courses of action to show, because in those models, in that type of analysis, you need to build in the harms. And that is why they've not done it, because we knew that the harms would be devastating.
Absolutely. And people, we were ringing that bell for 2 years. I want to get Michael in here because Michael and I had a conversation a few months ago about children and lockdowns and school closures. And you said something that very, very much resonated with me, especially as a mother. You said that those policies, in your view, represented a kind of child abuse.
Yes, I did. Oh, by the way, thank you for having me on again.
Oh, happy to.
Paul made a lot of interesting points, but one important point we have to remember that from what Paul said is when we talk about the hundreds of mass shootings, those are only the mass shootings. Plenty of other people are victims of violence. Plenty of other children are dying from suicides, from drug overdoses, or from violent crime, all of which is being relegated by mass media today into sort of the background noise of general crime. The only reason these incidents got reported is that these are the extreme, exceptional sorts of atrocities that can't be ignored. I remember I'm in regular correspondence with a like-minded woman in Wisconsin. She lives in a poor part of the city, and she told me from the time the lockdowns began, she's hearing gunshots every night. She knows these were happening. Everyone knew they were happening, but none of it got reported. I don't want to drift from your question, but yes, when as Paul says, everybody knew from the moment these policies were inaugurated that they had to have profoundly dislocating effects on children. they had to have profoundly psychologically stressful effects on children, as well as adults, let's not forget, but certainly on children. And you do that knowing what the consequences will be, and you don't even attempt to weigh the benefits against the costs. That in itself, it seems to me, has to be described in social terms as a kind of child abuse. I've also argued, and that, by the way, I was making that argument in September of 2020. I would argue today that it's worse. I think that it's not just a question of recklessness or indifference to the consequences. I think that part of what is happening is deliberate, not in the sense that the government wants to cause people to kill each other, but that the people who have engineered what Paul said, I like the phrase, or the lockdown lunatics have engineered, is really based on a goal of social atomization. I'm not saying that's what every single one of them wants to achieve, but it is entirely consistent with the whole policy, a set of policy initiatives that have been put in place since the spring of 2020. And I think that's why it remains so popular with the government long after any possible arguable medical justification could have been advanced. I don't think it could ever really have been justified, but it certainly couldn't be justified. By 2021, there was just no way anybody could claim that it was serving a medical purpose. But there's a lot to be gained economically, socially, politically by the people on top when the rest of us are separated from each other. And
when the peasants outside the gates are fighting with each other over the last crumb of bread or the cause even of these two events. So it's quite interesting. I did deep dive, I'm a mom, so I did deep dive the backgrounds of these two boys. And Paul, you alluded to this, and if you look at the timing of when things started to go south for these two kids, especially in the Gendron case, the Peyton Gendron case, the Buffalo case, he would have been 15 or 16 when the lockdowns happened, right? So we see them now as 18, which is almost a grown person. But man, we've been going through this for 2.5 years. So they were 15, 16 when the shit hit the fan. Extremely vulnerable. Both, I hate the word, loners. They were both kids who were different in some way, super shy, bullied by their peers.
I was too at that age, and I know what that feels like.
Yeah, and even as I understand it, this latest young man in Uvalde, he even had a lisp. Right, his mother was a drug addict. Apparently, that's why he was living with his grandmother. Also, a loner, no friends. Slightly effete in the photograph. I mean, it's just these kids were just. And also, he also, as I understood it, came to school one day with cuts on his face from self-harm. He'd actually cut his face up with a knife. Now, we can talk in a minute about how we're failing kids generally with mental health, but anybody who's denying that there is some sort of correlation, whatever the percentage is, between what we did in this disgusting and dangerous social and cultural experiment called lockdowns and school closures, they're not seeing it for what really happened here. It could not, in my view, be more clear. Do you agree with that, Paul?
Well, absolutely. And the thing about it is that what Michael was saying is so credible and so accurate. Look, I mean, in every aspect of this, we knew from our Athenian science, 400, 500 BC, so 2,500 years ago, we have ancient writings that showed when the Athenian plague, they knew that the people who had exposed themselves and gotten plague and recovered and survived, they were the ones who were able to tend to the new people who got plague. And that showed us, even in ancient writings, while they could not even connect the dots yet, that there was immunity that you accrued from prior exposure to pathogen. Even in a prehistoric way, we have that evidence. We saw natural immunity 2,500 years ago. We had a study in 2008, 2010, where researchers looked at the blood of survivors of the Spanish flu. And they found, so these people were like 95 years old. So let's say 100 years old. they found a cellular immune response to the Spanish flu in these people's blood. And it showed that natural immunity, exposure to prior pathogen and infection, lasted at least 100 years. So when I wrote that natural immunity is lifelong and bulletproof, that was not just pulling it out of the air. We had the evidence. And the truth of the matter is this. When you guys talk about the mental health, my argument in that piece I just wrote in Brownstone, and connecting the two and saying, look, we have a larger societal issue, and this will not end here. We have many more mass shootings by 18-year-olds to come. It's coming. Yeah. And the reason is, I'm not just talking about the ability to take a well young person, and derange their minds, and they become bad during the lockdowns. I'm saying we had many youth that were already troubled, like the way you described that guy. They're living on the edge, on the fringe. They were the type of people that you need to not watch, surveil, but you need to be conscious of in your society and give them the kind of support. They need some mental health. They have issues. You said he had a lisp. He was a loner. You didn't know what his home life was, etc. And look, when I wrote that paper with Dr. Howard Tenenbaum out of UFT and Dr. Parvez Dara, Dr. Rish, Dr. McCullough, we wrote a paper we looked at lockdowns, school closures, mass mandates. We found from the beginning of this pandemic in February of 2020 to today, not one lockdown in any country, in any setting, in any society worked. Zero. Not one school closure worked to stop transmission or reduce any risk. Not one mass mandate. I am not saying we found one. We found none. And that recent paper by Herbie et al. In Johns Hopkins, that review, if you look at the review, every single study that they quoted came from my paper. So we already put it together for them. We had already declared a year and 2 months ago that everything failed. And I wanted to say this. That guy in Texas, not Texas, Buffalo, the Buffalo shooter, the 18-year-old, Jeffrey Tucker wrote, he's the editor of Brownstone. Yes. He wrote a seminal paper recently about the lockdowns and the first shooting. And then he asked, we agreed that I would write a paper to try and connect, which I did, the Texas shooting to the Buffalo, and try and see if I could expand it, which I did, talking about masking and everything. But the truth is, Jeffrey's paper, right? If you look at it, you read part of the Buffalo Shooters Manifesto. He told you what the lockdowns did to him. He's actually telling us that he was not this way before the lockdowns. And because of the lockdowns and the isolation, in his own words, he had the time to go on these devastating websites and read all of this hatred, and it poisoned his mind. So we have the evidence. He wrote that. So anybody who wants to have a discussion about, well, maybe these are just bad people. No, I am telling you in my own words. My words. They're based on everything that I know. We had parents in the United States going to the emergency rooms in America in different states. The news media refused to cover and report what I'm telling you here in words. But I was there. The states were rolling it up to the White House. I can tell you, we had parents who were presenting to the ER with their 8, 9, 12-year-old child in their arms, limp, unresponsive, telling the ER doctor, we think we might have killed our child. Please help us quickly. And they're telling the doctor that I've been out of work for a year. My husband is beating me. I am beating him. We are violent each other every day. I'm angry. I'm miserable. The mother's saying I'm devastated. I have no income, and we are fighting. And today, we beat the boy. Now, could you help us? That's what we were seeing, and the news will report it. It is the physical abuse of young people and children during the lockdowns and the school closures that schools normally pick up and function as our flag, and that's my argument. These guys may have been not missed, Somebody may have noticed and would have been brave enough to bring it forward. It is the sexual abuse of little children in their own homes that schools monitor and pick up. There was value in keeping schools open. Most children in America, the public didn't realize this, but most children in America get their only food, their only one meal a day in the school setting. Even the rich kids, because they don't have time in the morning to grab a breakfast in their own homes. So they wait to get to school. When you close schools, when Fauci and Birx closed schools and the CDC, millions of American children went without food for months. And we were seeing that in the government, and that's why we were fighting them and begging them. We understood this was beyond COVID, that it is not just that the school closures were ineffective, but we were seeing the abuse. We were seeing the starvation of children. We were seeing the collateral damage then that the media and the cafe latte laptop class, the Zoom class, the middle class and the upper class people didn't care about, because their children could have get private tutors and could have Zoom and could have Uber in and Amazon shop and whatever. So this was a devastating situation. That's why when we say that as we open societies, we need to go back and we need to figure out who made what decisions, because we need to hold every single person. I don't care if it was your brother had a senior position in the government, and we need to fine him. We need to penalize that person financially. If we show in a proper public inquiry, proper, no kangaroo court, proper, that their decisions were reckless and costed lives. If lives were lost because of somebody's decision making, we have to clean them out financially, take every cent. And for some people, I want them to sit in a jail for what they did. They killed people by their policies. They costed the lives of children. Period. And I will argue with anyone that these lockdowns and school closures killed our people, adults and children, and somebody needs to be accountable.
I could not agree with you more. That was a really important soliloquy for us. Michael, I actually feel like crying after hearing that. It's so true. Right?
And by the way, it's absolutely true. And by the way, let's not forget these politicians knew this. Yes. Joe Biden was a senator in the 1980s. In the 1980s, the Reagan administration, just a little detail, the Reagan administration wanted to cut back funding for school lunch programs. And everybody and his brother marshaled all the data that Paul just said. This was in the 80s. They said, no, we can't do that, because huge numbers of people in the United States depend on school lunch programs for their only real meal a day.
Yes.
And that information was used by the Democratic Party to stop the Reagan administration, or at least slow it down in some of these initiatives. And Joe Biden was an influential senator in those days, just as one example. We knew what we were doing, not just the experts, not just the health officials, but the politicians. They've been there before. And when it was politically expedient, they argued against it. And this time they all went along. And that cannot be considered an accident.
Well, that's kind of why we're doing the show. Like, I'm going to say this out loud so our listeners really understand that I'm not like them. I'm not jumping in as someone who was a COVID policy skeptic for early on, since March of 2020, and using the deaths of these children to make a point. I thought long and hard about last week's show. And then this happened, and I thought long and hard about it again. That's not what I'm doing here, and that's not what we're doing here. There's probably an argument to be had about guns. I don't understand how mentally ill teenagers can get guns, but that's not what we're doing here today. And we're not doing that because that's what everybody else is doing, and they're using that so that they don't have to look at what these policies did. As long as they're saying, oh, this is pure evil, that is not an answer at all. And as long as they're saying it's guns, 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 which they're doing, that is also not an answer at all. It may be a piece of it. But
by the way, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael. I was on a bit of a rant.
Paul mentioned Jeffrey Tucker's piece, which I've read. I think all of us are friends of Jeff's. He's been encouraging me to write for Brownstone. My pieces have just been too long lately, and on a variety of subjects. But one of these days, I'm going to do it. But anyway, he's been very encouraging about what I've been writing. But it's remarkable. I didn't read this whole manifesto that the kid wrote, but Jeffrey quoted. Okay, well, he quoted a crucial. I mean, the kid was as explicit as possible about when and how he started to become radicalized, and this was reported in the news media. But if you notice, it was, to the best of my knowledge, no one ever mentioned the circumstances as being causative. They always just said, well, it meant that he had time. He had a lot of time on his hands, so he could go and brood on this thing called 4chan or whatever it's called.
That's the point.
Well and good, but so you're right. It's not just that he had time. He was alone. He was isolated, cut off from his peers, cut off from his elders, cut off from his social support, cut off from educational, all the things that provide a ballast for us when we drift. And boy, do we drift when we're teenagers. Yes. Lots of us do. And he had nowhere to catch him. It's kind of like that famous letter from Thomas Jefferson where he talks about his own childhood and said, I had no one. The reason I had a bad childhood is I had no one to help me. His father had died, and he said there was just nobody around to sort of turn me around and hold me to a better path. That's a general human experience. And it has nothing to do with specific circumstances. And when you impose those conditions, I hear Paul's agreeing, you impose those conditions on huge millions of children, you're going to have consequences for it.
But Michael, the thing is that when you have children who, let's say they're on the straight and narrow, and then you have some who little trouble, need a little more support. They have statement, capture a child when the child is good, and big them up and expand them and celebrate them and etc. and reward them even. Capture that child, showcase them. But you also have to capture the child when the child is not good. When the child needs support. And it's so critical. And the thing is, for many of these children, same way that they get their only meal in school, especially poor minority, African-American children and minority children, I'm telling you something that the news media, they starved, my friend.
Oh, I know.
They had nothing.
And they were being starved intellectually also, a point that I tried to make in that piece. And it's not because I think the school systems we have are wonderful places. I've spent a lot of my life criticizing the system. I'm kind of a pedagogic radical myself, have been since I was in high school. But the experience of being in school, of being with other people, being with peers, exchanging words, and remember, this was being deprived. Our kids were being deprived of this before the COVID coup began. This intensified it. But we were already moving in a direction of social atomization. And we know that many of the Silicon Valley moguls were actually thought that school closures was a good opportunity for them, because they wanted to push us in the direction of what is being called distance learning, a kind of learning that was mediated through computers and machines. So it wasn't as though they didn't have an idea what was going on. It didn't just happen. It wasn't all an accident. This was, as Paul is saying, this was a policy. It was a social plan in which it was obviously considered acceptable that a certain number of people were going to be utterly wrecked by it. I can't think of anybody who was helped by it. I don't think there's, as Paul said, I don't think there's the slightest evidence. Even the propagandists have not been able to come up with any that school closures actually saved anybody's life from this respiratory virus. But we do know what they did to damage people. And by the way, we haven't paid the whole price yet, folks. There's already evidence showing that toddlers, kids that were in their 2, 3, 4 years old who were forced to wear masks are showing decreases in IQ.
Yes.
And that's not just going to be intellectual, folks. That's going to be a lack of social development, difficulty in relating to other people. You could have problems in empathy because we learn to empathize by watching other people's faces. I worry very much about the bill that will come due in 15, 18 years when these kids are 18 and 20 years old. And what kind of society will be seeing then? I'm sorry,
Well,
I didn't want to digress. Yeah.
Here's what they'll do. They'll say they're pure evil, and they'll start arguing about guns. That's what will happen.
Well, they'll do
right?
that. They'll blame it on white supremacists. They'll trot out all the usual. And by the way, just so nobody accuses me unfairly, I don't think ordinary citizens really should have access to assault rifles. I don't know why, as you said, I don't know why mentally ill people can get hold of extremely dangerous weapons. There is a legitimate discussion to be had about gun control. The United States, not so much Canada, the United States has a crazy gun culture. That is true. And it does contribute to deaths in various ways. But that's not what's going on. And I will say this too, because everybody is saying all these other countries had the same COVID lockdowns, et cetera, and they're not having the same kind of mental health problems. I would argue with that, but also they say, what makes America different are the gun culture. But just so you understand, I'm sorry.
No, but let me finish. Canada's gun culture, like we don't have a gun culture, but there are a lot of guns here, right? There's a lot of guns in Canada. It's a mistake to think that there is not. And Michael Moore actually addressed that in his Columbine documentary. I think here's my take on, and it's not an easy black and white answer. And of course the media doesn't like that. But why this is happening in America in the way it is because America is always kind of the tip of the spear or the canary in the coal mine, right? It's a more acute, more highly divided landscape in the sense that things are more extreme in America, I think, than they are here, right? We're heading in that direction, and our politicians are adopting, and the news media here are adopting many, many of the same dangerous and divisive tropes, but it's more embedded in America right now. And I think that culturally and spiritually and in many, many ways, that there is a petri dish in America that hasn't fully formed yet in other Western countries. That's my take.
Maybe. I'm sorry. I'll let Paul.
No. But look. The thing is, when we saw that guy, Munassian or whatever his name is, who took the truck and killed a bunch of people in Shepherd and Yonge intersection in Toronto.
Yeah.
12 people and ran them over. So one can argue it's not necessarily the gun. In Islamic countries, they use knives and swords and they chop each other up. They do that in Europe. Europeans get attacked and killed.
That's true.
Right? So it's if you have a evil intent and you're deranged and murderous and you're evil and depraved, you will use whatever weapon at your disposal. Yes, in America, there are a lot of guns. The issue is, I argue that Canada has as big a problem. And I am telling you from what I saw in Canada, how people treated each other. Canada is like a pot waiting to explode. It's almost like Canadians. I saw a level of vindictiveness and pettiness on Canadians that shocked me. In places like Quebec, etc. Yeah. Even in Toronto, I saw neighbors doing things to each other on behest of the government. And when Doug Ford, look, I'm not getting into politics, but let me just say, when the provincial government in Ontario decided that day, they said, okay, now we're going to get a police that if you come out onto your driveway and go out onto the street, if you recall this, they said that the police had the right to stop you and interrogate you. And then all of a sudden, everyone revolted and reacted, and the police came forward and said they're not going to do that. And then the next day, the Ford government had to say, okay, well, we won't implement that. That demonstrated two things. It demonstrated to us that these people were not making public health policy. They were making political decisions.
Yeah.
Because if it was really needed public health wise, they would have not reversed it. But quickly they realized that night that was a devastating step. And second, they were going to use the police to abuse the people because the data had already accumulated that the masks were ineffective, the lockdowns were ineffective, and people were already struggling with these consistent lockdowns that were harming people. And in that piece I just wrote, you raised the point, Michael. That's what I was trying to say. It was the masking of society and the masking of young people and the masking of the population. sever the connection between people. And that humanity and empathy that people, I am arguing with you. I am saying that we are about to see a lot of devastating crimes that we've never seen before. Because what has happened is human beings now become disconnected, and the mask reduces your inhibitions. That's why in an execution, one of the parties are masked.
You masked, that's right.
Either the executioner or the person to be executed, because you have to separate the humans from each other, because the executioner will not be able to commit that final act. Once I could see your eyes and your face properly, you and me have a conversation human to human that's very different. So we don't know, as you just said, the societal implications of what we have set in place here. We're going to have decades of trauma from what we've done here. It was devastating what we did with these masks. Devastating.
Yeah, masks alone were devastating, especially for children, but for everybody. Tolstoy wrote what you just said. Tolstoy said that we always mask executioners because you can't look at the person that you're going to kill. And people do, but it's still a very old social recognition that you need that distance between people in order to defeat the natural empathy that might otherwise develop. And that's the point. You cover a person's face, you suppress empathy. That's why, for example, Israeli propaganda, for example, always used to show every Palestinian in the pictures were always wearing masks because we were supposed to feel frightened by them. We couldn't see their faces. They were frightening. And we didn't feel empathy. That everybody knows that. This is very, very, as you say, very old knowledge. This goes back centuries, that the masking of executioners and the separation of people by such means. So this is not a secret and not an accident, not a mistake. Good heavens. I'm sorry, I didn't want to derail you.
No, that's okay. I did want to just talk a little bit about the angle of hopelessness and going back to the this manifesto, which I read. He also had a Discord chat room conversations. This is the Buffalo shooter, Peyton Gendron, that really, really exposed how completely broken he was, and broken by COVID. The interesting thing about the COVID timeline, is that he says in his, I can't remember if it's the manifesto or the Discord chat, but he says, I've had 3 birthdays. One was the day I was born. One was the day when I was 3, when I first had full consciousness. I was a human being living on Earth. That was quite smart. And number 3 was March 15th, 2020, right? COVID lockdown time.
Right.
He also was going to school in a hazmat suit and a respirator, and left a family party because the people he was visiting at the family party were not taking enough COVID precautions. He'd been terrified by the fear porn, left the party and made his way home through the woods. Yep. Alone, and went, as he says, I went down into my basement, right? Onto the screens, onto the nihilism of 4chan. I mean, it's just, it's almost textbook. And for people who might say, this kid's obviously disturbed, he was bullied and a loner and had no friends. Of course, he was devastated. But what I want to make clear, and I'm sure the two of you would agree, is the idea that when we say mental health problems in teens, we're not just saying that healthy teens get sick. We're saying that unhealthy teens get sicker, right? They
do.
Right?
I must say it's a sickness for society as well. You know, I've made this point in some of my published pieces. I'm a lawyer as well as a writer, which may be more sensitive to this, but I don't think one has to be. You know, when you start to teach people in every way, at every level, that human beings are a threat to each other, that basically we should look at every human being as a public enemy. You cannot reconcile that view with the tradition of democracy. You cannot have a people ruling in society when the people themselves are the enemy, when every individual is a threat to you.
Yeah.
This is directly contrary to that whole tradition of liberal democracy on which the societies we live in are supposed to be built. And you can't attack that foundation without having social consequences. This is, as you say, it's a political initiative. It's a social initiative. When people are separated from each other and told, as this kid obviously learned, that other people are not part of you. They're not something you join with. They're not part of a community. They're not we the people. And you're not about to exercise your right to assemble, as we say in the Bill of Rights in this country, peaceably to assemble and redress the government for, petition the government for redress of grievances. On the contrary, they are your grievances. They are your enemy. They are the people you're afraid of. The only people you can depend on come from somewhere else. And that's what he did. He looked for somewhere else to save him. Well, okay, that was partly the product of his own individual circumstances, partly the product of his mental illness. But, in some sense, we're all there. Our whole democratic structure of society, our way of thinking about ourselves and our communities and our political system has been turned on its head.
Yeah. And also, I will say, and I want to get Paul's response to this too, that I did a program about a kid in Nova Scotia, Canada, who died a terrible death of meningitis because the hospital was so focused on COVID. They wouldn't treat him, right? Absolutely devastating story. I had his parents on, and it was, he was 18 too, ironically, but, it was an unbearable interview to listen to. They took him to the emergency room 3 times and they wouldn't treat him. They wouldn't investigate him because they were worried he had COVID, which is weird because if he did have COVID, would they have treated? It just made no sense, right?
The protocols have been turned on their head too. Now the idea is we don't want to treat people. Somehow the people are just too dangerous even to treat.
But I want to take that even further for these 2 kids who did the shootings. Again, if we try to have some empathy, which isn't to say sympathy, but try to put ourselves in their shoes in the time coming up to the shootings, they were living in a world totally focused on COVID, where nobody would be looking out for problems with kids. That's for down the road, right? Do you have COVID or do you not have COVID? And are you going to infect me or not infect me? Was absolutely the only dynamic in their lives for 2 years, right? Including from their very teachers whose COVID manifesto I read, and not manifesto, but their demands, which were really scary. So Paul, what do you make of that? Did the singular focus on COVID as the only issue in the world in some places, did that lead to what we saw? Okay, so I think we just lost Paul's connection for a minute. So maybe, Michael, you could respond to the idea I was putting forth, which is that there was such a singular focus on COVID as if nothing else mattered. And I'm wondering if that also is maybe an element driving this idea that the chickens are coming home to roost.
It's part of it. It's part of a whole pattern that really set everything we used to know and believe in on its head in ways that, frankly, and I don't think of myself as particularly optimistic, but ways that I did not anticipate. I did not think that it would be possible, really, to do what has been done in the last couple of years. But it was done in part, as you say, by this absolutely monomaniacal fixation in the popular media and in political systems through public intellectuals, through all our media, on this one issue. I remember I wrote a little thing at the time. I don't have it around now, but I called it Tractatus Coronavirus, and it was a sort of a parody of Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, in which I had a series of numbered statements about COVID-19. And basically the idea was, one of the first things I said was, there is one disease in the world. There are no other diseases in the world. He begins by saying that the world is the total of all the propositions, right? The sum total of all. I said, the world is COVID-19. And that's how it began. And it wound from that through the idea that everybody is my enemy except the state. And I'm only safe if I depend on the state and do what I'm told. That's really what those two things really go hand in hand. The singular focus on COVID-19 obviously had devastating health consequences and was predicted to. People were warning of this from the very beginning. It also is connected intellectually and politically with the idea that if that's the only thing that matters, then all the political institutions we've grown up believing in go out the window. If all another person, I remember early on, I wrote something on social media to the effect that we have to be careful. I think I woke up pretty early, but I'm annoyed with myself now at how long it took me. But this was late March. And I remember posting something to the effect that we have to be careful what we're doing. We're breaking down a lot of basic institutions, and not to mention the right to assemble, which is protected by the First Amendment of the Constitution. And I was immediately denounced by a range of people saying that I was asking to kill people. And
you're selfish.
I had no interest in human life, and I have no concern for people's welfare. And this took me quite by surprise at the time, I must say. But now I can understand the connection. If you think only in terms of an infectious disease, that's your only reality, then all the ideas that have to do with popular will, which are based on the notion of popular assembly and popular interaction, public discourse, all of that has to be sacrificed.
Well, and how we care for struggling teenagers, right?
Well,
isn't that's kind of germane to what we're saying here, right? That they, if you look at the Texas Teachers Union's proposals for the schools, they're very, very intricate about, about what, sanitation they want and what rules there have to be and how do we keep the kids separate and make them eat outside and, all these kind of weird things for a demographic of people who are not going to die of COVID-19.
Oh, heavens, no, they never have.
But I didn't see anybody saying, we need when COVID is over to, or even during COVID, to have these children's psychiatric needs addressed in some way.
Sure.
Peyton Gendron was released from a psychiatric hospital during COVID, right?
Sure.
So there's pretty big red flags there. Pretty big.
One thing I've always objected to in my writing and tried to sort of overcome is the compartmentalization of thinking. This is an area where you shouldn't distinguish in any sharp way between politics and mental health, because both healthy political systems and healthy mental health systems depend on certain presuppositions, and it's those presuppositions that we're attacking. It's not an accident that when you have teachers' unions, they're supposed to be about education, which means they're supposed to be about caring for children. And instead, because of this laser-like focus on the possibility of a particular infection is the only reality that matters, they are actively, as I wrote in my piece back in September 2020, they're actively working against the interests and the welfare of the children they're supposed to be teaching.
Yes, absolutely.
This is a political fact. It's a political phenomenon that has obvious mental health consequences. But part of the danger of it, what makes it so insidious, is that people don't see it, because the teachers probably thought, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, which perhaps I shouldn't, but I just tend to do that. They probably thought, well, we're trying to protect our members. We just want to make sure they're safe. But if you allow that idea of safety to become so defined that it attacks the principle of human interaction, then it's not health policy anymore. Now it's a political insurrection. Let's use that word, since it's being improperly used in other ways.
Yeah, no, but I guess what's scary to me about that premise, which is the kindest take on the way the teachers behaved, is this: if they didn't know as teachers that what they were doing was going to have devastating consequences on the health and mental health of these kids, then they shouldn't be teaching. That's thing one.
I agree.
And it also looks like they were putting their unions' health ahead of kids' health. And what I mean by that is, if they looked at the data, they would have seen what teachers might have been vulnerable to a bad COVID outcome, and they could have replaced them with teachers who didn't have that bad COVID outcome in order to keep the schools open. But they didn't do that because they were protecting themselves. Sorry to be mean.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. And this is part of a political system that has been brewing for a long time. I can't blame them exclusively for its development. We're living in an increasingly mean-spirited political environment.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
And that's been going on for decades, and this is one of the consequences. But to play along with that is unconscionable, even if you didn't start that game. They didn't start it, but they have no business continuing it. You can make the decision to leave that business, but if you're going to be a teacher, I think you owe a certain commitment to what you're doing. It's a very strange world. One of the things that has been happening, certainly in this country over the last several decades, perhaps in Canada too, it was detailed by an anthropologist named David Graeber, who's getting a lot of attention now posthumously because of a book he co-wrote about the dawn of, I think it's called The Dawn of Everything, about the origins of civilization. But he also wrote a very interesting book in 2018, just before all this started, called Bullshit Jobs.
Yeah.
And he pointed out in this book a very interesting thing. It's not just a rant. I mean, the title might mislead you into thinking it's just some sort of somebody just sounding off in a bar, but it's not. This is the work of a real anthropologist, and it's a very interesting book. But he points out that one of the things that's been happening with all the wealth that's being accumulated in the United States is that the super rich just don't have anything to do with it. And instead of investing in production, which they're not interested in doing because they're not convinced that anybody's going to be around to buy the stuff they produce, they surround themselves with flunkies, with people who really have nothing much to do, but whose existence makes them feel better because they've got retainers, like a medieval lord, the medieval lord of the manor who's always got people around. There's got to be somebody to stand outside the door. There's got to be somebody to walk behind them. So in some ways, we've actually returned to that. Thorstein Veblen, of course, wrote about this many, many years ago. But it's become very much part of our reality, so that we're living largely in a very artificial world where many people who seem to be successful and productive are really neither. And that's part of our political economy as well. You take a society that's already reeling under such stresses, and you start hammering at it the way we have for the last 2 years, and a lot of things can collapse. I say that very reluctantly, but it's true. Civilization is a much more fragile thing than I think we generally like to believe.
Well, I believe there is also, as a result of all of this, and I'll bring this back to the two mass shooting events that have brought us here today, but there is really a lack of moral clarity. There is absolutely no will on behalf of legacy media, except for a couple of people, to discuss this in a way that actually might prevent something, again, from happening in the future, or something that may reflect badly on the media's obsession with supporting the COVID-0 narrative that has ruined Western civilization, right? And I want to ask you about that. I mean, do you feel that we are living through, I feel we're living through a time of a real lacking of moral clarity on a number of issues. Do you agree with me about that? What's your take?
I do. And I want to say that I don't mean by that I'm trying to impose some priggish moral system of my own on everybody and saying, if you don't do all the things I like and don't do the things I don't like, unless you adhere to those standards, society is going to hell in a handbasket. That's not my idea of moral clarity. My idea is keeping a focus on the things that are most important, the things that we all know are most important, but are persistently ignoring under the pressure under the mania of this COVID coup. Things like this have happened before, right?
Yeah.
They happened in the development, notoriously, of the Nazi state. We saw a lot of it in this country during the Red Scare years. There's more than one, but I'm thinking particularly now of the late 40s and 50s, when the only thing that seemed to matter was whether you could be in any way associated with communism. I just recently read an essay by Arthur Miller in which he mentions visiting his alma mater, the University of Michigan, and discovering in the 50s, and discovering to his amazement that students were actually avoiding getting housing that was made available to them through the university's housing cooperative, because it had the word cooperative in the name of the organization. They were afraid that if that word showed up on their record, they might be accused of being communists.
Like comrade,
funny,
right? Like you can't.
Exactly. It sounds funny today, but this really had enough. This is how people were living, and it affected their lives. It affected everything about what they did. I mean, this meant that many kids couldn't find housing at all, and many students were having trouble with that. But you take a thing like that, and it has a huge distorting influence on how people develop and how they mature. We did it here not just to college students, not just to adults. We did it to children all the way down to 2 years old. We were putting masks on their faces. And that's not something we've done before. This is...
And we were remarkably uncurious about it too. And the people who should have been curious about what the outcome might be, many of them just signed on. I did do a review, if I could just say, Michael, of the warnings, the mental health warnings that were put out by various kind of, pediatric associations. And, and they were there, right? But the media would not run with them. And the problem with the media not running with them, which is what Paul was talking about, is as long as the media is silent or not, kind of aggressively pushing a point, the politicians and public health officials who are causing the problem feel no reason to change course. There was never any accountability pressure from the media to change course on some of these devastating problems. And we are seeing it now absolutely in connection with these two shootings, including, which you wouldn't have heard this, but earlier in the show, I talk about how we still don't have a timeline of when the police went in or didn't go in to rescue those kids. And it's looking a little bit dicey now. Some people are reporting that they sat there for a long time on the outside of the school, but the media weren't asking those questions on when this first happened. They weren't.
I've done my share of freelance reporting, and my father was a professional reporter for many, many years. Even the basic, normal questions that you ask, what, why, how, when, that was not asked. The only issue was guns. And it was remarkable to see that. By the way, let me tell you one thing you may not know, because this is on the point you were making about government overreaching and the lack of mention of this in the media. We had a huge outpouring of press reports recently in the United States when a federal judge in Florida struck down the mask mandates for transportation. Yeah. I'm sure everybody heard about that. There was a lot of nonsense written about it, but there was something that was never mentioned in the press at all. And I noticed it just from reading the judge's decision and then looking at the government's briefs just to confirm that what she wrote was correct. It was all right there in the decision. Everybody claimed to read. The government consistently, the federal government in this lawsuit, consistently took positions that were so extreme that they invited judicial curtailment. At several steps, they could have taken a more conciliatory position that would have made it much more likely that the mandates would be upheld. For example, they could have done a public comment. They could have taken public comments and gone through the usual administrative procedures before enacting this administrative order. They decided not to do that. When they argued the case in court, instead of giving reasons why this mandate was necessary, they said, we don't have to give you reasons. We're the government. We can do what we want.
Yeah.
Those arguments were first made, and I know this, I lived through it. They were first made by Richard Nixon when he was president, was trying to come up with an excuse for not giving the tapes that he had recorded in the Oval Office to the Senate. He lost that argument. Everybody in the United States was against him on that. Everybody said, no, you can't do that. You cannot say, I'm the president, I make my own decision. You can't question me. Nobody's above the law. Well, guess what? The Biden administration did exactly that in this case. And this judge called them out on it, but the media did not. And that's something we've not seen before. That's an important new development. It's consistent with what you just said. They're not holding the government back. And when they don't hold the government back, it's not going to be held back.
Yeah. How bad do you think this is going to be? I mean, I have a really bad feeling about where this is going now, especially with the singular focus on guns and evil and no kind of really intelligent discussion about what may have driven these guys to doing what they did. What is your take on where we're going now?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, and so I will begin by saying that I hope I'm wrong. I'm not an optimist by nature, and I really don't see any reason in what's going on around us to be optimistic. I'm very worried. I'm not just worried about more atrocities like this occurring, though I feel it's likely they will. And remember, these are only the tips of the iceberg. We're the icebergs that are floating by. Lots of kids are being hurt by this in lots of ways. We only notice it when somebody shoots, 10 people at kills 10 people at a supermarket or 19 kids at a school. But as I said, it's not just what happened in the COVID coup. It's what this has done to all the institutions of our society that have traditionally held up the basic pillars of a liberal democracy. It seems to me they're all crumbling. Nobody can rely on the news media today. And, we're not the only people saying that. Even the people who write this stuff are writing op-eds about how awful it is that people don't trust the media. They know this is a reality, but they don't seem to understand what they did to earn it. I don't have a television, so I don't watch this stuff regularly, but I am seeing, I've seen some comments quoted from Tucker Carlson's show. I don't know that I agree with everything he says, but he's speaking up about this, and he's right.
Yeah, well, he did quite a good show last night. That happens frequently where I'll be preparing for a show that's going to drop on Friday all week, and then on Wednesday or Thursday, he kind of it aligns with my thinking. But he is right in connecting what happened in these two instances, both in Buffalo and in Uvalde, to COVID. Not exclusively, there's other things, but we need to talk about that.
As he's especially right in pointing out that it hasn't been mentioned. That's the real failing. You see this sort of phalanx of liberal media all talking about guns and refusing to talk about anything else. It wouldn't be like that if the issues were different or the shoe were on the other foot. But to answer your question, I think we can expect to see one emergency after another being declared for one reason or another. It may be about white supremacists threatening to take this January 6th inquiry, which I consider a show trial, is again sort of throwing up ideas that there's some kind of looming insurrection in the United States, and at any moment somebody may try to overthrow the government. That's going to be thrown at us just as it was in the 50s about the Communist Party, and it's equally laughable. We're also going to be hearing, I think, more about climate change as a great new emergency that's going to justify taking away a lot of freedoms. With all these things around and all the benefits the government can gain by claiming them, as they've just learned over the last 2 years, I worry. I worry very much. I'm not optimistic about where our societies are going. I wish I could be.
And my sense of it, and I think you probably would agree with this, is that even where I live, I feel like I hear more sirens. People are more angry. In Toronto, there seems to have been an uptick in gun crime, not mass shootings, but gun crime and other kinds of violent crime. People need to understand that you can connect those dots, right? These things don't happen for no reason. And people have been warning for 2 years that isolation and being not connected to your family because of COVID rules, whatever, all the things, wearing masks, which hide our beautiful faces and our inability to emote to each other, the divisiveness around vaccine mandates, the othering of various people in our cultures as if they have no value. I mean, talk about, did that infuse these kids? Did they pick up on that some people have value and some don't? I can't say it did, but we're going to be, I just want our listeners to understand that if they're sensing that things are hinky, they are hinky, and they're hinky because people are traumatized and nuts and sad and disaffected. And there's a direct line, right? There's a direct line.
That's right. That's right, Trish. And unfortunately, it doesn't take that much to start corroding the foundations of society. I live in an apartment building. I see what goes on here. It started a little over 2 years ago when we were told not to talk to each other, not to congregate in the lobby.
Right.
Or in the laundry room because it was dangerous.
Yeah.
And then there were reports about how some people weren't wearing their masks. And guess what? We started getting snitching. Certain people started reporting on other people. Well, as of now, I notice that people aren't talking to each other, even though we're theoretically allowed to. And we're seeing problems that we never had before. People not disposing of trash properly, people taking the publicly available carts and apparently hoarding them, which never happened before.
Right.
It seems like a small thing, but multiply that all across the country. And whenever I talk to people, they confirm that things like this are happening where they live too.
Yeah.
You see those elements of social cohesion, what you call moral clarity, starting to fray. It's not because people don't know right from wrong in some abstract sense, but because you don't feel the connectedness to a community that these things really depend on.
Well, what's interesting about that you just laid out, that is how mental illness affects people who are probably pretty healthy, right? They get irritable and chippy, and they take the grocery cart, and they rat each other out, right? So that's the mental illness for the people who are probably
look at people on crowded streets these days.
Oh, I know, I've noticed. Yeah, I've noticed, man. So it's like I said about a baseline, right? If you're healthy, you're struggling a bit or maybe a lot before this happened. If you were not so mentally healthy before all of this happened, you are really struggling, and you may be a danger to yourself or other people, which we are now seeing. And people need to recognize that. The media is not going to tell you that. And I'm not making it up because I'm a COVID skeptic. It's real. And we have to start talking about it. And we have to hold accountable the people who did this, right?
Absolutely. Look, these facts were reported in public media. These are not controversial issues. They're not fringe issues. It's just that they're not being connected in popular media to what's going on. We know how many children and youths were affected by adversely affected by the lockdowns. We know how many contemplated suicide. There were shocking figures, something like 25% of all children in the United States. All of this was reported. You could read about it, but it won't be talked about in this connection. And that's dangerous.
That's dangerous. And what I should probably emphasize is that both Peyton Gendron and Salvador Ramos also contemplated suicide.
Absolutely.
So, right.
I always thought that the famous Columbine shooting, which Michael Moore made a fine film, coming from my experience of being bullied and how I felt as a high school kid, I always thought that really should be described as a showy suicide. Yeah. I mean, yes, they killed a lot of people, so naturally you look at it in those terms. But from their perspective, I think they wanted to get out of the world, and they wanted to make a big splash when they did and take down a lot of the people that had made them feel awful. It was really a way of killing themselves. And that's, for all we know, that's exactly what this kid may have been doing.
Well, and I hope the Buffalo shooter, obviously he's pleading not guilty. One does. You're a lawyer. You understand. I would welcome, and I know people will say, oh, it's too traumatic if he pleads, if he doesn't plead guilty because we're going to live through a trial and it's going to traumatize the town. And I understand that. But part of me wants to see that go to trial, because if his lawyers are good, they could maybe lead some of this evidence about diminished capacity and lockdowns. And it would be very, very interesting to see if they're going to do that. I actually reached out to them, but I haven't heard back.
I think he deserves a Clarence Darrow, just as Leopold Loeb did, and for essentially the same reason, not because he's innocent, but because somebody needs to raise the issue of what made this happen.
And not so he can get off, and not so he can not be punished, right? Yeah. We're not saying that he should go to jail forever if that's what the courts decide.
That was Darrow's argument with Leopold and Loeb. They're going to jail for life anyway. Yeah. But he argued for their lives because they could have been executed. But he said we have to understand this is a symptom of a social ill, and when you see it that way, you're going to look at their personal responsibility a little differently. And it's not that they got off, but he did successfully get people to think about that what happened in a larger framework. And I think we should try that again. I don't know if the lawyers are there to do it this time. I hope they were, but we'll see.
Well, it's expensive, right? You need big, fat, expensive expert witnesses who are like $800 a day or $1,000 a day or $5,000, whatever.
I could talk your ear off about the failings of today's legal profession, but we'll leave that for another day.
But there may be some committed person who does it cheaply or pro bono, whatever. You never know.
There might, and we can only hope.
Because to see the argument put on trial under oath on a stand and then have an adversarial approach to questioning the thesis that you and I are talking about today, I would welcome that. I would love to put a pediatric psychiatrist on the witness stand to say, look, you guys were lighting a match.
Absolutely. Why not?
Here. Yeah.
Right. And if you're his defense lawyer, that's what you should want to do.
Yeah.
I'm just not holding my breath. I hope you're right and I hope it happens, but I'm not too optimistic.
Well, those great cases don't exist, right? We're kind of cheering for Johnny Depp's lawyer because she's pretty and smart.
Thank God I've spared myself that that particular show.
Well,
But,
it's just, that's the focus, right? That's the focus of the news media right now instead of more important things. But,
yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, look, I'm really glad you did this. And I'm just ending by saying that, I know Michael, and you folks know me to be someone who absolutely loves children and is anti-violence. I've been a big critic of the Ukraine war. So we are not in any way excusing what happened. And by not spending more time being sympathetic to the victims, we are, and I've had some bad days about what happened to both the people in Buffalo and in Uvalde. But my job on this show is to think critically. And I think there needs to be more clear-eyed critical thinking and less emoting right now. Emoting over this, the way the news media is doing it, by the way, which I think is really unprofessional, is taking away from the fact that they're missing a whole bunch of really, really important elements of this story because they're too busy lining up to look like they are so brokenhearted about the victims. That doesn't serve anybody. People cover wars without behaving that way, right?
Exactly. If you look at good war coverage, you don't report grief. You report the things that can convey grief, but you report what happened. And that's what we're not getting today.
Well, and they're not holding anybody accountable either because the politicians in these towns are all weepy and because, the cops all have to be heroes. It's just, we live in a world of kind of, cut and paste narratives that you're not allowed to really move away from in these situations. I was saying to my husband that, it will only be a day or two before they start calling this kid a loner, because we knew that was happening. Everything it's almost like it's scripted. Now, the loner thing is because that's who these kids are. They're bullied and isolated and alone. But there is a script that plays out here regardless of the facts, and that's very, very dangerous.
And then I suspect we're going to start seeing some large feature pieces in some of the liberal media like Atlantic or New Yorker about why we should start closing down some of the sites that the kid was frequenting, what kind of stuff you find on that. We really shouldn't permit it. This should be stopped because otherwise other kids are going to do the same thing. So we're going to go into a whole censorship direction on it. But again, the facts of what happened in the background of this, and the effects of COVID-19 mania on them will not be part of that discourse.
Yeah, well, because they were they were complicit in it, right?
You bet.
Yeah,
you bet.
That's what happened. So thank you, Michael Lesher, very much for doing this. Paul, we've lost our connection to Paul, so I'll thank him too. He was magnificent as well. And like I say, we care very much about the victims and guns, whatever role they played. I don't understand the law well enough to make an argument there. But we need to look at this part of it too, and that's what we're doing. So thank you, Michael, very, very much. And thank you, Paul, wherever you are.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to Paul as well.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Bye.
Did I just say bye-bye now? I haven't. That's my mother saying goodbye. Where that came from. But anyway, that was the great Michael Lesher, who is a very, very strong child advocate, and Paul Elias Alexander, who is an epidemiologist. He was an advisor to President Trump through Health and Human Services during the COVID days. And he's been a professor of medicine, a McMaster. He's just obviously a big deal too. And you know what was really interesting about that discussion for me was hearing, especially, both of them are really mad. Right? Both of them are really mad. And me too. I think it's the people who were saying, we're creating a problem. We're causing a problem. This is going to be trouble. I think those of us who predicted this, or who worried at least that it was coming and now we're seeing it, are, it's hard. It's a tough one. So I'm very, very grateful to those two smart and obviously very empathetic men. But they don't let empathy get in the way of spitting truth, right? That's the point. We live in a world now that pretends to be so very empathetic, while all the people who are spewing empathy are actually destroying everybody else. So I never thought I'd be in a day when empathy is a bad thing, but it's fake with a lot of people, right? It's not fake with these two. Okay, or me. right now. I might be vaguely empathetic one day, but I'm not right now. Okay, so I want to continue on with our weekly story of the Jagmeet Singh Peterborough. There's been a new development. Why am I doing this? Why am I focusing on Jagmeet Singh? I don't care about Jagmeet Singh one way or the other. I no longer will support the NDP for obvious reasons. I just feel that the Liberals and the NDP are destroying the country. And the Conservatives aren't far behind, but there may be maybe a little bit of light there. But I just feel, and this is an overflow from America, that using lies and hoaxes and smears and false claims to silence your opponent, as Jagmeet and Trudeau are both doing now, is very dangerous and will end us as a democracy. It's so blatant. It's, it's breathtaking. So I'm going to end my Jagmeet trajectory today. Last week, I played Jack Layton, wondering where he would be on this stuff, but who I liked and was friendly with, right? So Jagmeet was surrounded by an angry mob, is the word he would use. It was a bunch of angry citizens, right? They were F-bombing, which I don't think that gets us anywhere. I think we have to stop doing that. And when I say we, I don't mean I'm included in that group, but I'm saying as people who are protesting something, the F word doesn't work, right? It's just stop doing that. Because it opens a door for them, I think. So he was surrounded by protesters. The main question they were asking was, why did you lie about the convoy? Which he and multiple people in our parliament and in Ottawa City Hall and in the Ottawa Police Department did. They told lie after lie after lie. The Emergencies Act ended it, and now nobody cares that lies were told, except there's this kind of piffling inquiry that's not going to go anywhere, obviously, and everybody says so, right? So here's what's new in the Jagmeet Singh. He's surrounded by these people, some of them being pretty crude. They were aggressive too. It must have been scary for him. I admit that too. And the main question was, why did you lie? And he was ferried away. Somehow that event got turned into he was threatened, right? So listen to this clip. It's, I think it's Global News. And the reporter says he was receiving death threats or something along those lines. Listen to what Jagmeet says here.
This is what federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh was met with as he left Peterborough on Tuesday. A loud group yelling obscenities as Singh made his way to a vehicle. These videos are now going viral on social media, and the incident is making national headlines. Singh now saying he received death threats.
What I really want to highlight, there was folks that were saying some really bad, some really horrible things. They were saying, some folks were saying, I hope you die, and things along that nature. A lot of aggression and violence in terms of the behavior and demeanor.
Singh spoke again to reporters on Thursday afternoon.
For me personally and for my staff, I would say that was one of the most intense, threatening, insulting, and physically there was that feeling of intense threat. But I'm not personally surprised by that nor worried by that. I've experienced worse.
But is your staff worried? Are the people around you worried?
Yes, they are worried.
Yeah, so that event was spun into a couple of talking points, which we've talked about here. One that he was threatened and that there was violence, right? Okay. So I said on the show, I listened to all the tape, all of it. And there's no one threatens him. Not that I heard. And I said, if someone actually says something threatening to him, bring the tape and I'll put it on the show and apologize. Didn't happen, right? Still waiting for that. There was no violence. It probably was scary. You don't want to be surrounded by a bunch of mad people. I get it. But that's also politics. And as I've said before, maybe he should be trying to figure out why they're mad instead of just telling lies about them, which is what's happened here. So here is the new thing. Here's the new thing. I just want to preface playing this by saying that I keep waiting to be proven wrong. You know, I said the convoy was not guilty of virtually any of the things it was accused of that paved the way for the Emergencies Act. All of it was wrong. Lies, mostly. Or very convenient mistakes, right? That's what happened. I'm saying it. I've investigated these things. I've talked to people in high places who knew exactly about the arson, and they said, we knew on day one it wasn't the truckers, and yet that was used by politicians who didn't bother checking it out, right? No foreign funds coming in from Proud Boys into there. That's been completely disproven. No guns, no assaults. I think there were guns out in the Alberta protests, but we're not talking about that. And also, let me just say, those events were cleared away. The border crossings and that gun event, which I don't know anything about, I will be looking at it. That was all done by the time they got the Emergencies Act. So, right? So everything was either a lie or over or an exaggeration, or, as they've admitted, repeating one of the CBC stories about the convoy that was as wrong as can be. And their default position now is Pat King. I believe they asked Pierre Poilievre a question about, like, why is he hanging around or why is he supporting Pat King? People who support the convoy aren't supporting Pat King. That's all they've got now after all of the drama, right? So that's why I'm doing this, because, you know, the convoy and that protest was absolutely peaceful and it was legitimate. And what was done to it was a national tragedy, in my view, very much so. But that is a playbook that they are now getting away with, so that it's bad for Jagmeet Singh to be surrounded by angry voters. I get it. I bet a lot of them used to vote NDP when the NDP cared about working people, right? It's unpleasant for him. But they know they can get away with demonizing their political opponents by raising the flag of racism and threats. Racism and threats. Racism and threats. So I am saying, I call these things out and I say, if you can prove me wrong, prove me wrong. Send me the tape of somebody actually threatening Jagmeet Singh in Peterborough. Nobody could, nobody did. So here's what's happened. The police chief in Peterborough investigated this story, right? That was blown up by the mainstream media, you know, as if Jagmeet had been taken hostage by ISIS or something. I mean, it was insane the way they played it. And he's saying, no charges, did a big investigation, everything's fine. So wait a minute, death threats against an opposition leader and you're not laying charges? I guess that means it didn't happen, right? I guess that's what that means. No charges against the alleged racist hate speech, right, against Jagmeet? No. So, and of course that got very little play in the media. That's not going viral, is it? So here is the police chief in Peterborough. I mean, he's essentially calling Jagmeet a liar, isn't he?
Thank you to everyone in the community who reached out to us through the Crime Line, Crime Stoppers, email, and phone calls. It is important to hear from the community and gather as much information as possible to ensure a thorough investigation. The service assigned 2 investigators to the incident. Along with evidence received from the community, the investigators scoured social media and over the past week have watched and analyzed the clips provided by various sources. Investigators also spoke with the complainants in the matter, and pending new information, there are no grounds to proceed with criminal charges at this time. While the behavior, actions, and comments in the video are disrespectful and should not be encouraged or condoned, they fail to rise to the threshold of being criminal in nature. We recognize that this may not be the news some have wanted to hear. The fact that exchanges between those with differing opinions continue to be disrespectful and unproductive is absolutely troubling. And the systemic undercurrent of hate and anger should bother us all as a community. As we have during the past several years, the service continues to encourage residents to be respectful in their expression of opinion. Anyone with further information on the incident is encouraged to come forward and contact Peterborough Police or Crime Stoppers.
Get it? So what, you know how he's characterizing this? What did he say? Disrespectful and unproductive. That's what he said. And for that, there was a viral news story about those terrible hillbillies, the riffraff in Peterborough, asking Jagmeet why he lied about the convoy. I mean, that's what happened. I don't like the way they did it, but it's not right. It was disrespectful and unproductive, according to the police who investigated it. So there you go. Now we move from convoy statements to Jagmeet's statements about that. And we have this event from yesterday with, I think it was yesterday. It was the 22nd. Trudeau cancels appearance at BC event after protesters hurl racial slurs. So we don't know what the racial slurs are. I haven't seen any tape of it. Again, I'm not saying it didn't happen. I mean, things like this can happen. I understand that. But here's what the reporters caught. This is a terrible thing. Enough to make Trudeau slink off to his hotel or wherever he was staying to do the thing by Zoom instead. We don't like the way he's running Canada. It's scary, right? I mean, and then the same article ties Trudeau making that statement, right, about racial slurs, okay, to Jagmeet Singh's story, which now turns out to be mostly not true. Yes, it was uncomfortable and aggressive. No death threats, no racial slurs. Yeah, right. So they get they twist it. And so now they're building on it. Trudeau's building on it, right? And the media is going along. Earlier this month, police began investigating after a video circulated on social media that showed people hurling verbal abuse at NDP leader Jagmeet Singh during a protest in Peterborough, Ontario. You know what I did not check? I wonder if I can get it quickly. I wonder what day the cop made that announcement. Because if the media are still, let me just see here. If the media are still reporting the Jagmeet story in that way, hang on here, without saying that the police didn't make any charges, then they're also perpetuating a myth. May 17th, no criminal charges for Peterborough protesters for accosting. I'm going to look up the word accosting NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. Police, right? So the guy who wrote this story, connecting the dots to Trudeau's racial slurs allegation, didn't even bother to say in the story if he even knew that the police said it didn't happen, or at least nothing terribly serious happened, right? He says a video shows Singh encountering protesters. They can be heard shouting expletives at him and calling him a traitor as he gets inside a vehicle. Singh later told reporters he found these was intense, threatening, and insulting, right? But the police have already said no big deal. The police said it was disrespectful and unproductive. So, right? So now, even though this has been, just like the complaints against the truckers, debunked, right? Here is Trudeau using it to cause more trouble by saying that he had to cancel plans to attend a fundraising dinner. I don't know that he did, that did not happen. I don't know that. Could have. But, right, so far they're not exactly batting 1,000, are they, in the truth department? And this, let me just say this too. I don't mean to go on about this, but this is what is their new approach. People who are their political enemies are accused of all sorts of untrue and terrible things. That's what's happening here. And you know who was really upset about the Peterborough incident was Jean Charest. I mean, really? Why don't you get the facts first before you line up like Mitch McConnell, on something like this? This is a technique they're using. It's politics. It's not truth. And the media is backing them up on it. So that's my little update on Jagmeet Singh. I'll stop talking about him for now. Okay, and so the last thing I just want you to hear, World Economic Forum was meeting this week. It is a festival of entitlement by mostly thin people who want to run the world, and kind of do because we let them. So we're going to stop voting for people who support that. But I want to play for you. I don't always love Rebel News. Sometimes they do stuff I don't like. But look at, they were great on the truckers, and they sent a team to Davos, yay, to do what reporters are supposed to do. Now, this is Avi, I think his last name is Yemeni. He's been really good on COVID in Australia. He's been terrific. Really smart young guy and very brave. Doing what we used to call a jump interview back in my day. I did a lot of them, and I did them well. It was kind of my specialty. Then I grew to think they were unfair. But there are some times in life when they are perfect. And they're perfect when the person you're doing the jump interview with is so unattainable, so arrogant, so entitled, they will never sit down with you for an actual interview, that you do this little bit of theater, to show you're trying to get some accountability, right? So he did this with Mark Carney. And it's quite fun because you can see, although I think Carney handles it pretty well, he's quite composed and very smiley, that's good. He's had some media coaching from someone. The arrogance and the entitlement drip off of him. He's being asked about, these guys all fly in private jets, and they stay in fancy hotels, and many of them have yachts, and, just grotesque, while they yell and scream at us for climate change violations. And, dare we want to pay $1 for a gallon of gas? It's shocking actually how blatant it is. But anyway, Avi had the courage to confront him, and here it is.
I do lots of media.
Friendly media?
No, I do. No, God, no.
The ones that are here invited?
Look, I'm doing no media at this one.
Can we sit down and I'll make a time with you and answer some actual tough questions?
You can make a request for a meeting, and
so you can deny it.
I never do companies.
I understand. My one question is, can the Canadian oil and gas sector survive the net zero approach that's being promoted here?
As I said, I never do. If you want an interview with me, like everybody else, you make a request and we can have an interview.
And will you accept that?
Like everybody else, if I can fit it in, okay?
How do you justify how does the UN climate envoy justify the massive carbon footprint here today to set this up, this fake city for a week event? How did you get here? Did you fly? You walked?
Yeah.
Did you come on a private jet?
Of course not.
No, so how do you justify this? Look at all of this. For 1 week event, the carbon footprint is huge. Don't you think that's a bit hypocritical?
Oh, drop it.
No?
Drop it. Look, there's lots of progress being made. But look, I'm not doing a stand-up interview, okay?
I love that. That's really good. Really, it's just good. These guys deserve it, right? He's right. He's making the point that they grant interviews to people who worship them. They don't grant, and this is what's happening in media today. You see, he would never appear on my show. I mean, I certainly have the qualifications to interview him. He should, but he knows if he came on here, I'd be asking him really hard questions. They don't even have an answer for how they justify the private jet and the utter piggish hoggishness of the way they live and the money they spend and the resources they use just for their own comfort, right? They don't even, he can't justify it, right? And they don't think they need to justify it. That is what has become clear in the last kind of 3 or 4 years with the globalists and the elites, right? They've stopped having to justify what they're doing. They know they'll get away with it. Nobody ever asks these people hard questions about COVID policy either. Have you ever seen Dr. Tam in any kind of a dust-up like that with a Canadian reporter? No, they're too busy worshiping her, even though she's been wrong about many, many things, right? So that is great because it proves, aside from the entertainment value of it, I'm sure he's a perfectly nice guy, but he doesn't have our best interests at heart. And these are people who cannot, when they are actually confronted with someone asking them hard questions, they can't cope. They can't do it. They can't do it. That is gone from the national stage and the national discourse, right? There's a wonderful clip of Roman Baber, who I'm actually going to, maybe I'll dig it out and play it next week, being interviewed by Rosemary Borton. And she is, and she was trying to nail him on mandates. And he was, as usual, great old Roman. He's so good on the data and the wastefulness and the fake promise of the vaccines preventing transmission. He's so good on all of that. You could see her squirming, right? She didn't like what he was saying. Now, she should be a neutral person in that debate or in that conversation. It shouldn't have been a debate, but it ended up being one because she was so welded to the vaccine mandate position and narrative that she couldn't stand it. But I'll tell you, Roman Baber, under those circumstances, he knew he was going into an unfriendly crowd, right? He did well. And here's the thing. The other side will not go into an unfriendly crowd. They won't, right? They won't be interviewed by whatever the opposite of CBC is. I guess it's me now, but lots of other people too. So that was good. That was a good thing to see, and props to them. I know True North is also doing some good work over there. So that's really great. So we're going to end just on this. And everything I've been saying for the last sort of 10 minutes has been about Canada. For our international viewers, we are a microcosm of everything that can go wrong in the world right now. So following along with the tragedy that Canada is becoming is probably useful for everybody. And I just saw this came up on my Twitter feed today, and I do want to remind everybody of it. This is the Ottawa Police Chief, Steve Bell, warning Canadians, it's not a clip, it's just me repeating, warning Canadians that anybody who supported the peaceful Freedom Convoy, somebody added that because it's an editorial, who supported the Freedom Convoy will be hunted down and punished for the crime of speaking out against the government. I mean, right? The hunted down is his word, right? It's shocking. I mean, I can't even believe that happened. But on we go. And I think I'll leave you with the idea that we need to think about these school shootings in a different way. We need to think of them maybe as an artifact of this switch in our culture on a lot of fronts, what's happening to men, what's happening to cops, what's happening to media. There's so many failures here, I don't even know where to begin. So I think we need a new lens. And I hope we provided one that was useful for you today. And I will say to you now, as I say at the end of every single show, stay critical. See ya.